Hello there, and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what are we doing on this here channel? Well, we talk about the hobby, of course. Sometimes it's codex reviews, novel reviews, the history of the hobby itself, a drunken explain. There's a bit of everything for everyone. So today, as you can tell from the title of the video, it's all about starting your second army. So this is one for you guys if you have maybe one army, maybe even you've tried a second army and it just hasn't quite caught on. Tried starting a new army a couple times maybe, and for some reason it just doesn't quite grab you, it doesn't quite do it for you. So that's what today's all about, and I'm here to help you find a way to start a second army that you're gonna like a lot more, and hopefully keep going with it into the future. And so for today we're going to paint this model right here, and that will be the model we paint for the purposes of talking about your second army that will be a success. In any case, let's crack on. For those of you who've been viewing my channel for a little while now, you'll know that I have a few certain staples that I always come back to, such as things like test models and practicing colour schemes, and yes, we will get to those shortly. But I think the important thing to start off with is a few questions when it comes to doing your second army in either 40k or Age of Sigmar. It's worth mentioning up front that all of this advice obviously is optional. If you have multiple armies and you found a way for it to work for you, happy days, but hopefully I can add you something on this one here. So the first thing you need to do, especially if you only have one army or one army that you in your mind have completed, let's say, this is how to move on to the second one. The first thing you do, quite simply, is make a mental note, or you can write it down, of all the things you liked about your first army. Now that might sound a bit strange, but it's worth doing. Just make a note of all the things you liked about them. It could be the aesthetic of the models, it could be how they handle on the tabletop, it could be how digestible the rules for that army were, it could be any number of things. And do spend a bit of time on this, really figure out what it was you actually liked about that army. Because what that will do is that will give you a sense of what you already like in the game. This is what you've established to yourself, what you like about 40k or Age of Sigmar, and what you want to maybe even continue pursuing in some respects, or maybe want to build upon when it comes to it. So make sure you have that list of all the things that you already like about the army. And then once you have a list of all the things you already like, make a list of all the things that you're not certain about with that army. Again, this could be things such as the aesthetic of the models, it could also be the gameplay, it could even be the variety of the models as well. It could be anything, absolutely anything. Again, this is personal to you. And once you've got your two lists of what you like about the army you currently have and what you don't like about the army you currently have, then the next thing you can do is start to eliminate things off those lists which you are happy to deal with. That is to say, things that you don't mind sticking around and things that you absolutely do or do not want again. So for instance, let's say I'm playing Space Marines. Two things I have on the list of things that I like about my Space Marines is I like the broad variety of models, and I like the relative abundance of rules, shall we say. Like, the rules are very simple and there's lots of variety and lots of different ways to play. But let's say, for example, that I don't like maybe some of the limitations on the numbers I can have, so maybe I want more of a horde army, or maybe it's I want to have more vehicles in my army beyond things such as tanks or speeders, let's just say, for example. And that will give you an idea of the sort of things you want to branch out to and try in other areas as well. So just to quickly summarise on what we've done in the first couple of minutes here, is we will have established with our two lists the things we like and the things we don't about our current army. It will help us to start making some decisions, because what it will help you do very quickly is realise what armies are either similar to armies that you already have, or similar to the army you already have, I should say, and also things that are similar in that respect that you know you're not necessarily going to gel with. Now, one of the things about this system is that it does require you to have played a fair bit of 40k or Age of Sigmar up front, because in order for you to get a sense as to how your army plays, you do have to be quite familiar with the army itself, so that you can recognise the differences and similarities when you move on to your next army. So what you should do next in terms of looking at your next army is think about the aesthetic of the models themselves. Now, if you like the aesthetic of the models and that's something you want to hold on to, so if you like an army which is mostly one type of material, so you like armies where everyone's in heavy armour, or you like them a bit more varied, so there's fabric, there's flesh, there's armour, then this is something to bear in mind. Because what it will mean is that if you want a similar aesthetic, so Space Marines to Chaos Space Marines, for example, or arguably even Orcs to Imperial Guard to a certain level, depending on how you paint them, then that will give you a really strong idea as to what you want to keep and what you want to change when it comes to a new army. Because one of the biggest pitfalls when it comes to starting a new army is people starting armies that they are attracted to initially, but then they sit down to paint them and they realise that they are either too much of the same of the army they've already got and they get bored and move on, or it's so different that they don't really know where to start with the next army.
And this is a really important thing to do, because when it comes to 40k in Age of Sigmar, there is a way in, but when it comes to taking the next steps, once you've learned the basics of the rules and even some of the more advanced ways of playing, you do have to be able to know that the next steps you make are going to be at a pace which is going to suit you. This will be a lot easier to do if you are aware very concisely what you do and don't like about the army that you already have, as I said, but also it means that you have a firm basis in what you're going to be moving into. So if you do want something that is completely different, it's worth knowing that to yourself. You want an army that is nothing like the one you've already got. Whether or not you're already playing, for example, Necrons or Drukhari or Genestealer Cult in 40k, or Slaves to Darkness or Seraphon or Skaven in Age of Sigmar, making sure that you know precisely what you want to change is going to be a really important factor. And then this brings me on to the next point, and this point is twofold. The first point to this is know how much you're willing to spend. And the second point, interestingly enough, is know what you want to do with those models once you've got them, because these are two really important things that a lot of people fall down. So let's start with the first one, price point. Now, the sad thing about Games Workshop's armies is that not every army is bought equally, or is created equally, that should be. Some, such as Space Marines, will get updates reliably with every edition and new codexes right out the gate. Then you've got armies such as Stormcast Eternal and Age of Sigmar that have also risen to meet that as well. And then, on the other hand, you have armies such as, Tyranids, Chaos Space Marines, arguably Eldar, arguably Orcs until recently, and then we look over at the Age of Sigmar side, and the list goes on and on and on. But in all fairness, when it comes to Age of Sigmar, the armies are a bit more rounded. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, let's get back to it. But yes, because not all armies are created equally, it does mean that every army has an ever so slightly different price point. So your 10 intercessors for £35, if you're buying them for a Space Marine army, is one thing, but obviously that's about 200 or so points. You're not going to get 200 points from a 10-man squad of guardsmen now, are you? Which are not that much cheaper than the intercessors. So if you're looking at armies such as Imperial Guard, or Orcs, or even things like Tau or Tyranids, where there's a chance of there being a horde element to it, it's worth remembering that when you go in. And conversely, just because an army has fewer models does not necessarily mean the army overall is going to be cheaper. This applies especially to armies such as Imperial Knights, Adeptus Custodes, and arguably the Ogres in Age of Sigmar. I will be flicking back between the two of them because it's worth remembering this. But that's not to say necessarily that they are going to be more of a rip-off or they're going to be more of a pain in the ass to collect. Obviously, you only spend what you're willing to spend and you only get as many models at any one time that you can handle. But obviously, it's worth doing your research, because once you do establish what kind of army you want to move into, then you really do have to be aware of the price points, as I've said. But the reason the price points are worth knowing before you go in is because sometimes prices can catch you off guard. The price difference between your Primaris Captain, for example, even the Primaris Captain in Gravis Armor and some of the special characters can seem quite reasonable to some, but then you have to compare that to things such as Chaos Space Marine characters, or Death Guard characters, or Eldar characters, or Drukhari characters, where the price differences do vary quite a lot, and some of them are higher and some of them are lower. In armies which have big models as characters, such as demons, for example, and even orcs, arguably, that is something which can be a bit of a shock to the system. When you're used to spending £20 to £40 on your characters in Space Marines, and then you go and play Chaos Demons, and your Great Demon and 2 Heralds are suddenly setting you back nearly £150, it's quite a big jump. So the other thing to bear in mind when it comes to price before we move on is that because armies can be quite broad-ranging and oftentimes you may be taking multiples of the same unit, sometimes it's worth seeing if there are ways to save money through things like the Start Collecting boxes if you know that you can use multiples of the same thing, such as with Astra Militarum with the Leman Russes. Drukhari Combat Patrol is quite good if you take multiples of that, along with the Demon ones as well, because you can make quite a lot of good stuff if you get a couple of the Start Collecting for the Demon boxes. So just to very quickly recap on that point as well, it's worth keeping an eye on the price point because it can come as a bit of a shock, especially when you move from one army to the next, and this isn't necessarily dependent on the actual size of the army on the tabletop. It often has to do with when the models themselves release, the overall kit size, and a few other factors as well that are to do with Games Workshop's actual price points. But then we move on to the next one as well, which is once you have your models, you need to know what you're going to do with them. And I mean this holistically. I mean not just in terms of what they're going to be like on the board, I also mean what it's going to be like when it comes to painting them and when it comes to building them. Because if I use Space Marines, for example, as a starting point, and even Necrons at the moment, as well as if we go over to Age of Sigmar, Stormcast Eternals, and the Uruk tribes. The thing about those 4 armies, there's only one of those armies that actually has multiple textures reliably on every single model, and that is the Cruel Boys for the Uruks. And you have to remember, Necrons, Space Marines, and Stormcasts are primarily metallic or primarily armoured units. So they are covered head to foot in shiny armour that you can do lots with, granted, but it is obviously still just one texture. It's still armour all the way down. Necrons do arguably have the Gauss flares and the energy glowing on all their weapons. That is a given, but that's only a small detail on the model. It's not as much of a core part as the chassis or their shoulders or the arming of their limbs. Whereas with the Cruel Boys, you have battered armour, you have raggedy robes, you have leathers, you have hides, you have flesh, you have a bit of everything, which can be quite challenging because it's also quite specific to a very swampy, dirty, rangy look, which you don't really see in the other 3 examples I've already given. So one of the things that I've seen time and time again when it comes to people starting new armies is buying the models, building them, and even spraying them, and only then thinking, I have to paint these models, and at that point they suddenly realise to themselves, I have no idea what I'm going to do with these models. And that's okay. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Not knowing what to do with a model is something which I've struggled with in the past, and it's something which is not new to anyone. But it is something you have to plan for and prepare for. Because especially if you're painting an army with a very different aesthetic to what you're used to, you have to get used to going, say, for example, from flesh to armour or vice versa, or from bionic units to more raggedy units, going from guys who are almost wearing nothing but rags or scales, in the case of Seraphim, for example, to being an army made entirely out of wood, for example, if you're going to go off and play Sylvaneth. So I know these are quite silly examples, but this is just to give you a sense of the depth and the range that you will always find when you go from one army to another across the Games Workshop systems. So it's really important to actually prepare and be aware of what you want to do. And this is where I bring up my old classic, and it's right, you guessed it, test models. Test models in this area are essential because if you don't test out the colour schemes, have a little test as to what the aesthetic of the armies overall is going to be like, then you're not going to know what to do with that model. And even if you have looked at the codex and you've done the army list that you think you're going to like, it's really important, even at this stage, to make sure you get a test model to make sure you're going to do that. Because I'm sure I speak for many people, there is nothing worse than thinking, I know exactly what this army is going to be, than buying the models and realising, if I can paint them, great. But then you start painting them and you realise, I don't know what to do with these models. And I think that's a skill. That is something which you definitely develop over time. No one knows what to do with every model the moment they pick it up, unless you're, designing them or you work at Heavy Metal Studio. But that's a different story entirely. So, just to quickly recap those last 2 points, checking your price points of Games Workshop's armies before you start buying in, and actually figuring out what you want to do with those models when you've actually got them, in terms of both painting them, in terms of building them, and in terms of playing with them. And just to very quickly expand on that last point, when it comes to gaming with them, I'd always say start small. Never start with an army list that's more than 1,000 points. 1,000 points is quite manageable, it's at the cheaper end of games, it will give you a bit of variety to try different things if you want, and it will allow you to get a sense of what the army's like when it comes to the core models and a few additional units that you can tack on. Now this works for both 40Ks when it comes to having your troop units and a few extra elites and fast attacks, and also for Age of Sigmar when it comes to talking about the battle line units and having a few non-battle line units that you can work with just to get a sense of what the more extreme wings of these armies are like. Brilliant! So, now, just to quickly conclude on everything we've spoken about today, the first thing you need to do is make that list. What do you like about the army you already have, and what don't you like about the army you already have? And then, next step, what do you want to change, and what do you try that's going to be different, or what do you want to stick to that's going to be similar to what you already have? Then after that, check the price points of the army you want, and then the last step, make sure you plan what you're going to do with those armies, and make sure that you stick with 1,000 points to start with, and before you buy a single model, do some test models so that you know this is going to be the right army for you. So I hope this is all very helpful to you guys, and that you can use this advice to start your second or third or fourth army, and hopefully finish as well. Because there's nothing more satisfying than having a fully painted army on the board, and nothing more frustrating than having 1 or 2 models or a large chunk of your army that isn't finished. But as always, I want to hear from you guys. Do you have any more tips and tricks? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you.
So those are my thoughts on starting a second army and all the things you need to do to help get yourself there. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I post my videos on Wednesdays and Fridays, and whilst you're down in the comments, have a look at all the stuff I've got. Check out my website for the services I provide, my Patreon link if you want to support, or just my Instagram if you want to look at some pictures of toy soldiers. But in any case, thank you all very much for watching, goodbye, and have a lovely day.